Yeah.
And I was really intrigued by your switch from the active to the passive, which worked so well. And I wonder if you could talk about actives and passives and how you feel about what they do.
Okay, so I think that every American kid, every kid who grows up in the US is traumatized in high school into never ever using the passive voice ever again. And that's too bad because sometimes it's good, it's a tool. But here's what I like about passive. Passive will sometimes help you break up a log jam of words in your sentence because anything that in English will let you put words in a different order than you would ordinarily have to do in an active sentence might be doing you a favor in solving a problem. Something that I forgot to put in the talk that I always, one of the other things, I repeat myself a lot in the classroom. One of the other things that I always repeat is that I think of grammar, with a translator's pair of glasses on, I think of grammar as a delivery system for words. Grammar is the structure that allows the words to reach the reader's brain in a certain order, and very often the order in which the words reach the reader's brain are crucial for really the atmosphere of the sentence. And that means that I encourage my students when necessary, or when the straight up way doesn't immediately work, to look for different ways, different grammatical ways of putting the information in the sentence to give you more options syntactically, and passive is just a tool for that. That's why I like it. Also because, it switches subject and object, and that changes emphasis. And so often, if something is awkward about the translation, very often it might just be that the emphasis in the sentence is off, or that the word is not being sold well. Like, one example that I give a lot is in my translation of Kafka's Metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa has carved this picture frame using a fret saw. A fret saw. How many people in the room know what a fret saw is? I saw 2.5 hands. So my editor didn't know either. So a fret saw, it's like a jigsaw. It's a saw that it's a handheld little thing. It's C-shaped, a C-shaped piece of metal. It has a fine, skinny little saw blade and a little handle. And a jigsaw, we know because of the jigsaw puzzle. And a fret saw is like a smaller version of that for intricate little work. Fretting. I don't know. Baba, you've probably heard this example before. I'm sorry. But my editor also at Norton is like, I shouldn't have said, well, whatever. Sorry, Carol. Throwing you under the bus here, but it's a good example. It's a good example. She'll forgive me. She didn't know what a fret saw was either, and she said, well, can't you just substitute some other sort of saw that people have heard of? Can we make it a band saw? Since there's laughter, I think you know what a bandsaw is. For those who don't, a bandsaw has a base that's about the size of this podium. And so the idea that Gregor Samsa would slip it into his drawer in his bedroom when he's not using it is comically absurd. Obviously she doesn't know what a bandsaw is either. It's just that the word had recognition. But I realized that the problem with the word fret saw is that I had used it just the way Kafka had used it. And it was Gregor Samsa, blah, 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 with his fret saw projects. The problem was the compound fret saw projects. Fret saw by itself is comprehensible to us. You see that word and you think, it's a kind of saw. Don't know what kind of saw it is, but I'll use my imagination or I'll Google it. Fret saw projects, as a little hard clump, gets stuck in the reader's proverbial throat and doesn't go down. And that was what the problem that my editor was having. And so I wound up fixing the problem by rearranging the sentence a little bit. So I think that I may have built a crutch in there. I may have added the word woodworking, like the woodworking he did with his fret saw, or something like that, instead of fret saw projects. And in the next read through, she didn't even notice, which is the effect you want. And it really was just how the word was sold in the sentence. Yeah.
Questions? Back there?
How German are you?
I love that question. I love that book. I'm a big Walter Avish fan. I could have been living there now instead of here. So I started learning German in high school, 9th grade, which is way too late to be learning a language, but I took 4 years of high school in I took 4 years of German in high school, rather, and then I took another year and a half at Johns Hopkins, at the famed, fantastic German department, where I was the swine that the pearls of that German department were being cast before. So I, as a 18-year-old there, was taking classes with some of the most famous German professors in the country. I was like, this is my professor. And because they had a very small undergrad program, they also put undergrads in grad courses, which was great. And I went to Germany for the first time for my semester abroad. So I studied German for 5.5 years at that point, and my first experience was, I successfully took a taxi cab from the train station to the dormitory in Münster in Nordrhein-Westfalen, and my first attempt at using German was when I had to go to university to register, and I couldn't find the bus stop, so I asked this guy on the street walking his dog if he could point me to the bus stop, and he could not understand me. And I thought, 5.5 years, oh boy. Because I hadn't learned really to formulate sentences and speak so well, but I could read and write perfectly. And then because I had studied it so hard and long, 1 month later I was functionally fluent in German, much more fluent than I am now, because now I don't spend as much time in Germany. But I lived in German cities, and Zurich, which is a sort of German-speaking city, for maybe 5.5, 6 years if you add it all together, but in bits and pieces. So I used to spend 4 months a year in Berlin, but for the past 12 years I haven't been doing that. I go occasionally for shorter visits. So I don't know. I love German language and literature. It's just the richness of the body of literature available in German is just stupendous. And the language is so good. The language is so flexible. You can do so many things with it. You can put words, you can make up words because there's enough structure to allow you to be playful and people can still follow you. You can put things in not any order you want, but you have a fair choice of what order you put things in. It's it's really good.
So over here, Matt.
So this may sound like a naive question. I don't think it's quite as naive as it sounds, but I was interested in your discussion of translating poetry, how important kind of the idea of the multiple variances, multiple versions, multiple efforts, and also the value of reading other people's translations as you're working on your own translations. And I'm wondering, why is there this pressure to produce one translation for one original, right? Or is that something you've ever thought about? And maybe people even do this regularly. Like, why not create multiple translations in which you kind of illuminate then the various struggles that you've been through in trying to come up with appropriate equivalents?
Yeah, I mean, I've had students in my class literally produce 2 different kinds of translation of one thing because they'd be working on a translation that seems to want to go in this version, in this direction, that direction. I'm like, okay, do one of each, and develop one this way and develop the other that way, rather than this in-between thing. No, I think multiplicity in translation is great, and also I love reading multiple translations, especially in poetry. To sit down and read multiple translations of a novel will get old fast, but unless it's really short, but multiple translations of poems, you really get the sense of the different translations talk to each other, and I think that's fantastic. Well, for me as a working translator, though, I don't want to read anybody else's translation while I'm working on mine. Usually what will happen is, if I'm invited to translate something that has been translated before, I'll look and see what the other translations are to help me decide whether or not to take the gig. And if I look at the others and think, yeah, I think there's still one that I can do that I might not like less than one of these others, then I'll do it. But then when I'm working on it, what I'm trying to do is hear a voice for the text, for the work in English. I'm trying to hear my voice for the work, and seeing what other people do would just distract me from that. And the first translation of this sort that I did was of Hesse's novel Siddhartha, and I left some time between finishing my translation and when I had to give it to the publisher to look at the other translations when I was done, to see what they did with the hard spots. And because I thought, maybe I'll borrow some good ideas. And what I discovered from doing that was that the parts of the translation that I thought were most difficult were also the parts that the other translators also found more difficult. So like each of us had a different fudge, in certain areas, and I was like, okay, well they've got their fudge, I'll stick with my own fudge. But okay, that's a good example though, Hesse, because after I did a Siddhartha, the editor, this was Norton, asked me if I wanted to do a Steppenwolf for them. And I went, because that seems like the logical next step, and I went and looked at Steppenwolf that Basil Creighton had translated and started reading this translation, and I was like, damn, that translation was so good. It was fantastic. And I didn't feel I could do one that I would like better than I liked his, so I didn't do the gig. And now they've republished, or whoever it was, yeah, it was them, republished his translation, tweaked by somebody else, because I guess there were, some mistranslations in it somewhere, but the tone, the voice was so good that I just didn't feel that I could do one I would prefer to it. So I didn't.
I'm sorry, can I ask a quick follow-up? But what about the translating poetry? Like, have you ever been tempted, or are there translators who have made it part of their approach to provide 2 translations or 3 translations of a single text?
I have never.
There seems to be some kind of pressure to produce 1 translation for each original, when in fact you could think of translation that actually involves 3 different variants.
Yeah. Well, check out Christian Hawkey's book Ventricle, because he talks you through different versions of one chapel poem in particular that he's thinking of. He gives multiple versions in that book, versions by other people and multiple versions by him, as well as sort of, translations made by, leaving the original in a glass of water over the winter under your porch, and then translating only the words that survived. There's some of that also. It's a really fun book. It has some approaches to translation that are just overtly over the top playful like that, and some that are just, meticulously philological. So it's a combination, and the book is really saying, look what you get this way, look what you get that way. The truth of Trockle is inside here somewhere.
I'll just add on to that. Oscar Pastier's Baudelaire translations, where he does an experimental book of translations of one poem in all different...
They can't hear you over there. I don't know if this is on.
There's Susan. There's also a book by Oscar Pastier of variations on one Baudelaire poem, but it's about 30 variations ranging from a literal translation to anagrams and what's it called? Oberflächenübersetzung. Like a what is it?
Do we say surface translation in English?
I don't think we do. An acoustic translation, a phonetic translation, things like that. Just as another example. Are there more questions for Susan?
Coffee.
I had maybe one last question. So my question would be about this ventriloquism figure that you used, and I'm curious how that creates a difference between your working with living authors. I know you collaborate very closely with people like Erpenbeck and Tawada, and the translations that you've done of authors who've been dead for decades, Kafka, Hesse, Walser. As a translator, how do you face the challenge, well, both challenges, the challenge on the one hand of not being able to ask questions, and on the other hand, the challenge of thinking somebody's there who might tell you, no, you got it wrong. That's not what I meant at all. Could you say something about that?
Yeah. If you're translating a dead author, you wish they were alive, and if you're translating a live author, no, it's good. It's good. It's good. There's so many things I wish I could ask Robert Walser when I'm. So many things I wish I could ask him. But 2 living authors that I work with over and over again are Yoko Tawada and Jenny Erpenbeck. And both of them are really aware of what it means to be translated, and they both have actually quite different responses to it. If you know either of their work, you might already have some inkling of what that would be. So Yoko Tawada is very interested in randomization and, difference and cultural transformations that happen when you move works around. And she's very, very playful, and she'll do things like, the story of hers, Where Europe Begins, the title story of her collection, Where Europe Begins, ends with this like alphabet soup where it's a story of a train ride. It's this beautiful train journey story in which the character is basically going from Japan to Moscow, and the story is called Where Europe Begins. At the end, there's a conversation about whether Moscow counts as Europe. But as she's on the train, she's telling fairy tales she remembers, Japanese tales she remembers from her childhood, Russian tales that she's read. She's learning different stories from other people who are of different cultures in Siberia, telling their stories, and all of these things sort of interweave in the train journey. Her travel log she wrote before she left, and she's writing something on the train also. Anyway, but when she arrives at the train station in Moscow, something bad happens, but she's confronted with this puddle of water with letters swimming around in it, and there are letters that spell out the name Moscow, the city name Moscow, and each letter turns into something else, another, a character from the story, an object that played a role in the story, and so it's functioning. It's like becomes physical, all these things that are just based on letters of the alphabet, but alphabet soup is hard to translate, Even the name Moscow is different in German than in English, and in Moscow, it's hard to play an alphabet game satisfactorily because the word Moscow in English has 2 O's in it, whereas in German it has 1 O, and then at the end the other Moscow is AU. So each letter of the name turns into something. And in English, you're going to say, oh yeah, the first O turned into this, the second O turned into that. That's lame. And I'm like, Yoko, what do I do? And she's like, think of something. So I wound up interpolating the Russian name Moskva into the story, which uses 1 letter only once. There are Russian characters in the story. So one character at one point in the story had looked out the window and said, "We're here, look, it's Moscow." And in my version, she's so happy to be coming home that she's like, "Look, it's Moscow, Moskva." So she calls her city by its Russian name. So I taught the reader that Moskva means Moscow in Russian. And then I used those, and I turned the letters into things that were thematically linked to the story, but were different in part from the things she did. But in a way, mine worked out better because her story, the last object that appeared was from the first sentence of the story, which was an apple. And the story had begun with an apple, and now it's ending with an apple image. But for her to do, to get Apfel based on the German Moscow, A is not the last letter of the word, so she had to skip A and then come back to it. But in Moskva, A is the last letter, so I didn't have to do the skipping. So, my work game worked better. But she regularly says, she writes a lot of word games into her books, and she says, "I want you to play where I played, and I trust you to play in a way that fits the work." Which is, for an author to trust a translator, especially knowing what translators do. I mean, if you knew really what translators do, you would never read a translated book again. I mean, no, but seriously, every translation of a book really takes the book and makes it the translator's own. There's no such thing as a neutral translation. Every translation you're reading is the translator's interpretation of that book imposed on you. Sorry, not sorry. Jenny Erpenbeck also knows what translators do, so she's like keeping an eye on me. It's not like she doesn't trust me. We've worked together. We've done 4 books together. But she knows. And so, she'll ask me, "What are you doing for that?" And I'll talk it through, and she knows English. But like in the book of hers I'm translating now, there's a moment in which the main character starts looking up stuff in Wikipedia, German Wikipedia. And I'm thinking, honey, I'm going to cut and paste from English Wikipedia, because if I translate what German Wikipedia is saying, it's going to sound way too academic. Because look at German Wikipedia. It's written very differently from English Wikipedia. And so, and she's like, but, so we're still working on that. But basically, the translator is writing part of the book. The translator becomes your collaborator. And some authors are correctly made nervous by that.